Right, so I've got my paper divided in half and in half, and then I'm just gonna make 2 more tape lines, right here and right here. Oh, and one other thing, with the papers, you'll notice there is a smooth side and a bumpy side. The bumpy side, which is what we call the tooth of the paper, where we can feel the bumpy texture, is actually the front. So we wanna use the bumpy side as the front of our watercolor paper. All right, so I've got a tape line down the middle, both directions. If you don't, do you need more tape? Okay. And then I'm also gonna create my other sections as well. So we've got a million different bells going off during this period for lunch. We're lunch D, so we'll have class until 12:43. So we've got quite a long time still. All right, so some of my sections are a little smaller. They're not all perfectly the same, but it's fine since we're just practicing techniques today. All right, and once I've got my different
So we're
sections,
supposed to put them in the middle?
you want it to look like one line down the tall side of the paper and then 3 lines across. So you have a total of 8 different sections. So if I went in and I labeled these, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. All right. So with my different sections, we're gonna be doing 8 different techniques. We're gonna be doing wash, graded wash, wet on dry, lifting, glazing, dry brush, and resist. If you have extra paper towels, that can come in handy. For my students who are here, if you need a paper towel, I have a paper towel dispenser over at the front of the room over here. There's 2 over there. They're just a little harder to use. So I've also got my paper towel handy, which can be useful for some of the techniques. So I'm going to start with a wash. A wash is where we're applying color very evenly, and our color is diluted with water to make it apply to the paper more evenly. A wash is best applied with your largest brush. There should have been 2 different brushes in the pencil part of your kit and 1 brush in the watercolor kit itself. So the clear handled brushes, you should have 1 flat and 1 round. My round brush is the larger brush. Some of you might have a flat brush as the larger brush. Some of your brushes might be the same size, so you can choose either for the wash. But I'm gonna choose my larger brush, and I'm gonna get it wet with some water. And I've already got a little bit of paint in the top of my palette here. So I'm gonna mix up that paint with some water. If it seems like it's gonna be a really, really translucent color, I can go back to the same color and pick up some more pigment and mix it with my water. And then for zone number 1, I can even zoom in a little bit here. I'm just gonna very evenly apply the paint. And I don't wanna go over the paper too many times. I wanna try to spread out the paint as evenly as I can get it in one nice flat layer. And there's my flat wash. Now the it is reflecting a little bit and creating this highlight here, but you'll see it when it dries. It'll be nice and even. And then before I use any other color, I have to wash my brush in the water. So with the water, I'm gonna wash my brush. And this time I'm gonna pick up a different color. Maybe I'll pick up black. I haven't used black at all yet. And this time I'm going directly into the color itself. I'm not gonna dilute it with the water. And I'm gonna add 1 stripe of the very strong color along the top. So for graded wash, you're starting with a strong color and you're making it fade into black. If you don't have a big brush, just use one of the 2 brushes that you do have. And then I'm washing my brush in the water. And with the water, I'm gonna wipe the brush off and I'm gonna begin to pull this color down through my paper. So I'm gonna pull the color down into this area right here. Wash my brush again. Pull it down even further. So I've got a gradient from black to gray to white, and that's a graded wash. Yes, you can follow along. All right, so we've got our wash and we've got our graded wash. The next two boxes we're gonna do the wet on wet technique and wet on dry. So for wet on wet, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're using watercolor and painting on a wet surface. So with my brush, I'm gonna first wash it really thoroughly in my water to make sure that it's clean. And then with some clean water, I'm gonna begin to paint the water over my section where I want to paint wet and wet. And this is gonna get the watercolor paper wet, obviously, and it's gonna have our colors bleed and spread together in a really nice, interesting way. So maybe I'll choose some different colors this time. Again, you can choose different colors than me. That's totally fine. I'm gonna zoom in actually to the section itself. So maybe I'll pick up some yellow first. And you'll see when I paint, it doesn't have a harsh edge. It has a really soft, diffused edge because of how the paint is mixing with the water. So I've just got some paint there. If I want to use a different color and add a different color, I'm always washing my brush in between paint colors. Maybe I'll just add some green in here as well. And if I want to go back and if I want to add more yellow, I could do that too. All right, maybe I'll add a little bit more yellow with a clean brush. All right, now to contrast wet on wet, in box number 4, we're gonna do wet on dry. So this time I'm leaving the paper dry. And if I go in with my paintbrush and I make a similarly random design, you'll notice this time the edges are very clean. They're not feathering out or bleeding. You can really see exactly where that edge is. And it'll probably be even more obvious with my green paint. So wet on dry is good for harsh lines where we really want to see a controlled shape. So if you miss a box, don't worry. You can just watch the recording and go back and catch up on that box. But what we just did for wet on dry was we used the paper as it was, and we just painted a design with paint right on top. And because the paper is dry, you can see we have these harsh edges. Where we had wet on wet, we get these soft, blurry edges. But where we did not get the paper wet in number 4, we had sharp edges. All right, so our next box, box number 5, we're gonna do a technique called lifting. So lifting is where you lift away the paint. But to be able to lift away the paint, I first have to apply some paint. So I'm gonna choose a random color and I'm gonna put some paint down in number 5. All right, so right now this is just a wash of color, but for number 5, we're gonna practice lifting. So I'm actually gonna use another dry brush to lift away the paint. So if I just take my dry brush and I begin to touch the surface, it's gonna scoop up some paint. If I get it wet and I use that water and then I use the brush to soak up the water, it's gonna make it even more obvious. You can also use a paper towel for lifting. So where I tap the surface with my paper towel, it's picking up that paint. Maybe I'll even use a folded paper towel to get sort of a texture. So this is where we've lifted up the paint, where we can see the white of the paper. Now you'll notice it doesn't lift up 100% of the paint. There's still a light blue color here, but this sort of a technique can be really useful for clouds. You'll notice lifting only really works while the paint is still wet, but if your paint is dried and you want to lift right there, you can use a tiny bit of water and you can go back in and rehydrate the paint, and then you can lift up the paint with your dry brush or dry paper towel. So if you don't have the paper towel, you can still do lifting with the paintbrush. Just get it a little bit wet, and then you can use your paintbrush to pick up the paint. I'm using a smaller detail brush as opposed to my large brush for this though. For box number 6, we're going to do what's called glazing, and we actually need to do several layers here. So glazing is when you layer different colors of paint over top of each other. So mine actually started bleeding down here. So in this area where it was drier is a good example of glazing. So here I've got some pink glazed over green, pink glazed over yellow, pink glazed over purple. So I'm going to do a couple different vertical stripes of color in this area and then let it dry and then go back over that with a different color. It's really important that the layers are totally dry though. Otherwise it's going to do like what happened right here, which we don't want, which is called bleeding, where it sort of bleeds into each other colors in a way that's unpredictable. So I'm just going to paint some stripes of color for now in number 6 for where I want to practice glazing. You can really do any colors. This is a good way to see what happens when you layer certain colors over each other. And I'm just going to make them go all the way from the top to the bottom of my box. Because I have the masking tape, I can be a little messier with my edges. If you just drew the edges with pencil, you'll have to be a little more careful. And of course, anytime I'm getting a new color, I'm washing my brush. Maybe I'll leave just a tiny bit of space in between these colors so they don't accidentally bump into each other. Washing my brush before I get another color. And you can choose different colors than me. You don't have to choose the same color. All right, and I want to really let these fully dry before I go on to glaze another color in another direction. So while we let number 6 dry, I'm going to move my document camera here all the way down so we can see boxes 7 and 8. Box 7, we're going to practice a technique called dry brush. So I recommend using one of your smaller paintbrushes. I've found personally I like the paintbrush that comes in the kit with the wooden handle for this brush right here. And since it's called dry brush, you definitely want to make sure this brush is completely dry. So if it was in your paper on your or in your, if you're using it to paint with, make sure you have something like an old rag or a paper towel you can use it, wipe it all the way off with. Or if you have another brush you haven't used yet, that'll be good for this dry brush technique. So with dry brush, we're going to go into one of our paints that we've already hydrated a little bit. So I'm going to use a different wet brush and just add a tiny bit of water directly to my paint. And then with the paintbrush that's dry, I really want to feel it with my fingers, make sure it's nice and dry. I'm going to pick up some paint on the tip of my brush, and I can go in and apply it. And it's really going to highlight the tooth or the texture of the paper. Dry brush can be really good if you're adding grasses or fur or something like that to a painting. You can make longer strokes, you can make shorter strokes, you can make really light or round strokes. There's a lot of different things you can do with dry brush. Maybe I'll get another color here. Let's say I accidentally forgot to wash my color and I got a little bit of black in the brown and I want to fix it. If you accidentally get a little bit of paint in another palette, you can use a small brush. So I'm going to use one of my smaller brushes, and with some clean water, I'm going to touch that spot where I got it contaminated and pick up the wrong color and then wash it out in my wash water. And I can keep repeating that till I don't see the wrong color anymore. So now I got rid of that black that I accidentally put in the brown. My paint was a little bit too saturated there, so it looks more just like wet on dry. But the rest of this area is very clearly dry brush. It's got that distinctive feathery, open kind of look. All right, and our last section we'll talk about here in just a minute. This last area, we're gonna do something called resist. So you're gonna actually need either a crayon or you can use from your art kit one of the oil pastels, specifically the white oil pastel. So go ahead and find your white oil pastel from your art kit. With your white pastel, you're going to draw any kind of pattern or design in this eighth square. It could be lines, so maybe I'll do some zigzag lines, or it could be some shapes. It'll be a little hard to see what you're drawing since, of course, it's white on white, but if you tilt your body, you can sort of see the reflection a little bit. I don't know if I can show you the reflection if it's going to work. There we go. So if I tilt the document camera, you can sort of see what I'm drawing. And you can do that too with your own self as you're working to sort of see the shape of what you're drawing. And it doesn't have to be perfect either. Again, this is just a technique sampler. So we're getting an idea of some possibilities of what we can do with watercolor. Once you finish drawing your design, you're going to take any paint color and really just paint directly over top of your oil pastel. And what should happen is it'll reveal the design that you drew, because the oil pastel is resisting the watercolor since oil and water do not mix without an emulsifier. You want your paint to be pretty hydrated. You might need to wash your brush a couple times before you go back to the paint. All right, so there's my resist. And again, if it picked up some of the oil pastel in the brush, just give it a really good wash. Or you can use a paper towel to also help wipe some of that oil pastel out of your brush. All right, and the last thing we need to do is we need to finish our layering section. I can tell that it's finally dry since the highlight that was here from the water, I can't see that reflection anymore, so I know that my paper is dry. So with our layering, I'm gonna go ahead and mix up a different color that I haven't used yet. And I'm gonna paint horizontally since I previously painted vertically. All right, so you can see the layer there. It did sort of pick up and smudge my red a little bit, so maybe my red wasn't quite as dry as I wanted. So I might wait even longer before adding my other layer of glazing down here. I might say layering and glazing interchangeably. They're very similar. All right, just to finish my layering section, I think it's mostly dry. I'm going to go over with one stripe of brown so we can see that layer mixture. And maybe I'll do a different color down at the bottom here. Maybe I'll do purple. And I am mixing the purple with some water in the top part of my tray just to sort of dilute it a little bit so I can still see the color through. So it's not super strong, but we can see the 2 layers of color. So those are our 8 techniques. We went from flat wash to graded wash, wet on wet, wet on dry, lifting, glazing or layering, dry brush, and resist.